Professor Jim Taylor from the Australian Digital Futures Institute at the University of Southern Queensland presented a provocative keynote address to the 2009 International Conference on ICT in Teaching and Learning, hosted by the Open University of Hong Kong. Professor Taylor surveys a higher education landscape that is changing fast, with student demands and the costs of provision both increasing. In response, how can the productivity of teachers and learners be improved? Professor Taylor suggests that organizational strategies based on innovative blended learning practices supported by new technologies may now be an imperative.
My talk this morning is on blended learning and organizational development imperative, and I'd like to start by just giving a brief definition of blended learning so that we know what we are talking about. And I've highlighted the fact that it's the thoughtful integration of online learning and face-to-face learning. That's the way that I've approached it. And it's not just any mix of face-to-face and online. So I'll come back to that more in a moment, but that's how I'm approaching the definition of blended learning. And I'd like to look at blended learning in a number of contexts. The global context, the big picture, the consumer context from a student point of view, an institutional context of how important is it for institutions, and again, the technology pedagogy context. So I'm taking a fairly broad view of the blended learning initiatives. When we think about the global learning context, we've moved from an elite system in higher education to a mass system. These are some figures on Australia, where in 1946 we had 8 universities with 26,000 students. Now my own University of Southern Queensland has 26,000 students. So there's been an enormous development over the years, and relative to China, we're small fry in terms of numbers, but we've now got over 1 million enrollments. These are figures that I got off the BBC website in 2007, and I'm sure that the figures are grander now. But China has also moved from an elite system to a mass system, and now awards more degrees than the USA and India combined. There's a huge commitment of governments, of students, and companies to higher education. And the projections are that the numbers, the demand for higher education will continue to grow. So this is just one of many quotations that I could use where the number of students in post-secondary education worldwide will double in less than 10 years. And that is really quite mind-boggling. Another challenge I see is that quotations from the UN website that we will need 18 million new teachers, and that is only in primary education. Now, if we look at the capacity of the higher education systems worldwide to produce new teachers, there's no way that the current system can generate 18 million new primary teachers. But where we've got a challenge like this, as Peter Drucker pointed out, where we're in a growth, a changing period, we tend to act with yesterday's logic. So when we're confronted with the idea that we need to provide more access to higher education, the trend is to think, well, why not create more universities? Now, that's yesterday's logic. It's not making the best use of the technology that's available to create widening access to higher education. And this was highlighted in a study done by Sir John Daniel and a couple of his colleagues, which highlighted that in India alone, the government or someone would need to open 2 new universities every week for 25 years to meet the demand. And that study was done before the global financial crisis. But it's an example of old logic. There's no way that we can continue to meet the demand for higher education or continuing professional development without making use of technology. And to me, that's not a problem, because education is a process, it's not a place. And one of the things that we viewed for a while is that the internet will provide the only viable, cost-effective means to meet the demand for higher education and continuing professional development. So in that context, blended learning becomes particularly important. I also have the view that at the postgraduate level, that the vast majority of the educational process will be online. And we need to look at combinations of face-to-face teaching in disciplines and for particular cohorts of students. So the reason I believe this is that we've got a global financial crisis, and even though Cairncross made this point 12 years ago, I think in the end most of access to higher education is an economic issue. It's driven by costs of providing infrastructure, costs to students and the like. And I think this prediction 12 years ago that the death of distance, as Cairncross referred to it, would become the single most important economic force shaping society applies particularly to education, because we've got the potential for providing much greater access and at a cheaper cost than we currently pay. So here are some drivers for investment in blended learning. Economic sustainability of institutions I put at the top of the list. But there are other more important reasons, and from a student point of view, it increases flexibility, widens access, and importantly has the potential to improve the quality of learning and teaching. So I think the thoughtful integration of technology and face-to-face teaching can improve the quality of education. So that's the sort of big picture of why I think blended learning is important. And you might like to reflect on how important it is for your own institution. Some institutions, I think, believe that blended learning, just as online learning, was less important for them because they had huge demand for on-campus places. But it's my view that, in general, all institutions need to embrace blended learning. And I think the OU-HK, when it moved to become a dual-mode institution, is a good example of the way that all institutions will be moving. Most of them will be moving from face-to-face to embrace more online delivery in a blended way. And I think a good example of that is to think, how important is blended learning to your institution? The bottom line is the resource allocation. You know, how much resource is devoted to blended learning, online learning in your institution?